right, so today we're diving deep into a real veterinary whodunit. We're going to unpack this case report about a boxer dog who has some really weird symptoms.
Yeah, this is a really interesting case.
It's not just like a sad story about a sick dog.
Yeah.
It kind of shows just how hard it can be to diagnose these rare diseases, you know?
It really highlights how even with like advanced imaging, like MRI,
Right.
sometimes the answer still isn't clear.
Yeah.
Even with all the fancy tools we have, right?
Exactly. And speaking of fancy tools, we're looking at a detailed case report from Case Reports in Veterinary Medicine, published just this year, written by, veterinary specialists.
Yeah.
So it's we're dealing with some serious stuff here. This case is all about a 6-year-old spayed female boxer dog.
Okay.
Initially, she had a history of chronic kind of on and off vomiting, diarrhea, decreased appetite, but then things got worse.
Yeah, so the dog's appetite just disappeared completely.
Oh, wow.
And then she started showing weakness in her hind legs. And the vets found a heart murmur too, which just made everything even more complicated.
So we've got a dog with an upset stomach, wheat back legs, and a heart murmur. That's kind of a strange combo, don't you think?
Definitely unusual, yeah. And sadly, her neurological signs just kept getting worse.
Oh, no.
She developed ataxia.
Ataxia. Okay, so for our listeners...
Yeah, so ataxia means she's having trouble with balance and coordination, specifically in her vestibular system.
Right, that's the system that controls balance and spatial orientation.
Exactly. She also had a head tilt, and her pupillary light reflex was reduced.
So basically, her pupils weren't reacting normally to light.
Right.
All these signs were pointing to a problem in the brain, specifically the brainstem. What did the veterinary team think was going on at that point?
Well, there were a lot of possibilities.
Yeah.
Infections, inflammation, maybe even a brain tumor. Who knows?
Oh, gosh.
They needed more information, so they decided to do an MRI.
Okay, so they brought out the big guns, the MRI, for neuroimaging. What did they find?
The MRI showed a significant finding. Obstructive hydrocephalus.
Obstructive hydrocephalus, so that means...
Yeah, so that means there's a blockage that's preventing the cerebrospinal fluid from flowing normally. That's the fluid that cushions the brain and spinal cord, right?
Right.
And because of that blockage, the pressure inside her skull was building up, which explained the neurological signs.
So the MRI showed us there was a blockage in the brain stopping that fluid flow.
Right.
That explained the neurological problems. But the big question was, what was actually causing the blockage?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And unfortunately, the MRI couldn't tell us that. And to make things even more complicated, getting a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, was too risky.
Too risky. Why was that?
Well, they were worried that doing the procedure, which means putting a needle into the spinal canal, could make the pressure inside her skull even worse.
Oh, I see.
Dangerous, yeah.
So they're in a tough spot. They know something's wrong with her brain.
Yeah.
But they can't figure out exactly what... And then we still have the whole heart murmur issue, right?
Exactly. And that's where things took another unexpected turn. Echocardiography, which is basically an ultrasound of the heart, showed that her heart was enlarged and not pumping efficiently. The vets thought she might have infiltrative cardiomyopathy.
Okay. I'm going to need you to break that down for me. What exactly does infiltrative cardiomyopathy mean?
So... it means that something was infiltrating the heart muscle, messing up its structure and function.
Okay.
Like imagine a foreign substance taking up space where it shouldn't be, making the heart muscle thicker and weaker.
And did they know what this substance, this foreign substance was at this point?
Not yet. And to add to the mystery, her troponin levels were elevated.
Okay. Remind us what troponin is again.
Troponin is a protein that's released into the bloodstream when the heart muscle is damaged. So this basically confirmed the cardiomyopathy diagnosis, but it still didn't tell us the underlying cause.
So now we've got a dog with a serious neurological problem and a serious heart problem, and nobody knows what's causing either one.
Yeah, it was a real head scratcher. And tragically, despite all the supportive care, she just kept getting worse.
What happened then?
She went into cardiorespiratory arrest, meaning her heart and lungs stopped working. And unfortunately, they couldn't revive her.
It's always so sad to lose a patient, especially after everyone's put in so much work trying to solve the puzzle.
It is. It really is.
But these tough cases, as hard as they are, they teach us so much. They help us take better care of other animals in the long run.
That's true. Thankfully, in this case, they did a post-mortem exam, and that finally gave us some answers.
Okay, so what was the culprit? What was causing all these problems?
The culprit was disseminated protothecosis.
Proto what now?
Protothecosis. It's a rare and often deadly infection caused by this type of algae called Prototheca.
Algae. Wait, so something you'd find in a pond can make a dog this sick?
Yeah, it is a little surprising, right? But remember, these aren't your average backyard pond algae. Prototheca don't have chlorophyll.
Chlorophyll, so that's what makes plants green, right? Allows them to photosynthesize.
Exactly. So since Prototheca don't have chlorophyll, they can't make their own food like other plants.
Right.
So they have to get their nutrients from their environment. And in this case, that environment was, unfortunately, inside this poor dog.
Okay, so they found this algae in the dog. Where exactly was it?
They looked at her tissues under a microscope and found Prototheca organisms all over her body, but the highest concentrations were in the heart and the brain.
Ah, so that explains both the heart problems and the neurological problems.
Exactly. And remember the obstructive hydrocephalus we saw on the MRI? The vets think the Prototheca in the brain and the inflammation it caused was probably what blocked the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid.
So it's like a chain reaction. The algae invade the brain, cause inflammation, and boom, you've got a blockage leading to hydrocephalus and all those neurological symptoms. And we know from the postmortem that the heart was also hit hard.
Yes, exactly. The algae infiltrated the heart muscle and caused that cardiomyopathy that they diagnosed earlier.
So before we get too deep into the weeds about this strange algae,
Sure.
Can you tell us a little more about Prototheca? Like, what is it exactly? Where does it come from? How does the dog even get infected with this stuff?
Yeah, great questions. Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into protothecosis, this super rare infection caused by algae.
Yeah, it's definitely not your everyday diagnosis.
Not at all. In part one, we talked about this boxer dog who sadly didn't make it. And we were just starting to talk about Prototheca, the organism itself.
Right. So to recap, Prototheca is algae, but not the kind we're used to seeing.
Exactly. Prototheca are a chlorophyllous algae, which means they don't have chlorophyll. You know, the stuff that makes plants green and lets them use sunlight for energy.
Right, photosynthesis.
Exactly. And because Prototheca lack chlorophyll, they can't make their own food like other plants do.
So they have to get their food, their nutrients, from somewhere else.
Right. They have to get nutrients from their surroundings. And unfortunately, sometimes those surroundings are inside an animal, like in this case with the boxer.
Okay, so if they aren't usually found inside animals, where do they normally live?
Well, Prototheca are kind of everywhere.
Everywhere?
Yeah, they're ubiquitous. That means they're in the soil, the water, even sewage. We just don't see them because they're microscopic, but they're all around us.
Okay, that makes sense. So they're everywhere, but they only cause problems in some unlucky cases. How do dogs actually get infected with Prototheca? Like, are they swimming in dirty water or rolling around in algae-filled mud?
It's not always totally clear how it happens, but the most likely way is through ingestion.
Ingestion.
Yeah, so dogs might accidentally eat or drink something that's contaminated with these organisms.
So something as simple as lapping up water from a puddle could lead to an infection.
It's possible once they're ingested, they can enter the bloodstream and spread throughout the body.
And in this case, Prototheca really seem to like the heart and the brain.
Unfortunately, yes. And that brings us to another tricky part of this case, diagnosing protothecosis.
Right. We talked about how it can be tough to diagnose, even with fancy imaging like MRI. Why is that?
Well, for one, the symptoms are often pretty general, non-specific. Like with this boxer, her first signs were digestive issues, vomiting and diarrhea.
Which could be caused by so many things.
Exactly. So it's easy to go down the wrong diagnostic path at first. And even when the neurological signs show up, which happened in this case, they can be different depending on which part of the brain or nervous system is affected.
So there's no single sign that screams, this is protothecosis.
No, not really, which is why it's super important to consider it as a possibility, especially in breeds like boxers, which seem to be predisposed to this infection.
That's a good point. Vets need to keep protothecosis in mind, especially in boxers with these kinds of symptoms, even if the initial signs are vague.
Absolutely, and that's where lab testing comes in. But even then, there are challenges.
Like what? What kinds of challenges?
Well, the gold standard for diagnosing protothecosis is culturing the organism.
Culturing it?
Yeah, basically growing it in a lab from a sample of blood, tissue, or CSF. But culturing Prototheca can take a long time and needs special expertise. Not all veterinary labs can do it.
So it's not just a simple blood test you can send off anywhere?
Nope. And even when you do get a positive culture, it doesn't always mean the dog is actually sick from protothecosis.
Really? Why not?
Well, remember, we said these algae are everywhere.
Right, ubiquitous.
Yeah. So a dog could have prototheca in their system but not actually be sick from it. It's like finding a couple weeds in your garden. It doesn't mean your whole garden's overrun.
So just finding prototheca doesn't automatically make it the bad guy.
Exactly. You have to look at the whole picture, the dog's symptoms, history, and other test results. All of that together helps vets interpret the culture results.
Okay, so cultures aren't a perfect method. What other tools do vets have to diagnose protothecosis?
Cytology can be helpful. That's when you look at cells under a microscope. And with protothecosis, the algae often have a pretty distinct look. They're round or oval, and they sometimes have these internal features that look like a Mercedes-Benz logo.
A Mercedes-Benz logo, that's a pretty specific visual cue.
It is, but it's important that the person looking at the sample knows what they're looking for. Not all vets are familiar with how these organisms look.
So it seems like early diagnosis depends on a few things. A vet who's suspicious of protothecosis, access to specialized lab tests, and someone who can interpret the results correctly.
Exactly. And sadly, a lot of times, like with this boxer, we don't get a definitive diagnosis until after the dog has passed away.
That's why this case is so important, though. It reminds us to be aware of protothecosis and to think about it even when the initial signs are vague.
I agree. It's a good lesson in being thorough and keeping an open mind when we're dealing with these tough cases.
So the million-dollar question is, how can we get better at catching protothecosis early, especially in breeds like boxers, who seem to be more susceptible?
That's where research comes in. We need better diagnostic tests, ones that are faster, more accurate, and easier for vets to use.
Ideally, something vets could do in their own clinics.
Right. Something that gives quick results so we can start treatment sooner. That would be a game changer for these dogs.
For sure. Earlier diagnosis could lead to better treatments and better outcomes. Speaking of treatment, let's move on to what can actually be done for dogs who are diagnosed with protothecosis. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the strange world of protothecosis. We've been on this journey following the case of a boxer dog, who unfortunately died from this unusual infection.
Yeah, it's a tough case for sure.
We've learned about the prototheca algae itself, how tricky it is to diagnose,
Right.
and unfortunately, how often it's only diagnosed after the dog has already passed.
It's true. We often don't have all the pieces until it's too late.
Exactly. But when we left off, we were talking about treatment. So what can vets actually do to help a dog with protothecosis?
Well, that's where things get even trickier.
Oh, no.
There's no magic bullet for protothecosis. There's no one-size-fits-all cure.
So what options are there?
The main treatment is antifungal medications.
Antifungal medications.
Ah.
But prototheca is an algae, not a fungus.
I know, it sounds weird, right?
Yeah.
But even though prototheca is an algae, it actually has some things in common with fungi, like how their cells are structured and how they react to certain drugs.
Interesting.
So that's why we often try antifungals first. So they kind of work like distant relatives with some shared vulnerabilities.
So which specific antifungal drugs are usually used?
Amphotericin B is a strong one that's often used, especially for severe cases. It can be really effective against prototheca, but it can also have some pretty bad side effects, especially for the kidneys.
So a double-edged sword then. Powerful, but you got to be careful.
Exactly. There are other antifungals too, like fluconazole and itraconazole. Those are sometimes used with amphotericin B.
Okay.
It all just depends on how serious the infection is and how the dog's responding to treatment.
And how long does treatment usually last?
That's another tough part. Treatment for protothecosis can go on for a really long time, often months or even years.
Wow, that's a big commitment.
It is. It takes dedication from both the vet and the owner to stick with it.
But even with all that, is it always successful? Does it always work?
Unfortunately, no. Some dogs don't respond to the treatment, and the infection can come back.
So we still have a lot to learn.
Definitely. That's why it's so important to keep researching new and better ways to treat protothecosis. Ideally, treatments that target prototheca more directly and without so many side effects.
Absolutely. So what's the latest in protothecosis research? We talked about better diagnostic tests, but what about new drugs or therapies?
Researchers are definitely working on that. They're looking into new types of drugs that might work better against prototheca, hopefully with fewer side effects.
Yeah.
One idea is to develop drugs that target the algae's metabolism.
Metabolism.
Yeah, or drugs that stop them from reproducing.
So it's like making a key that only fits one specific lock. You target the algae, without harming the dog's cells.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it.
What else is out there?
Immunotherapy is another promising area that's basically using substances to boost the dog's immune system.
So it's like giving the dog's own defenses a power-up to fight prototheca.
Yep, exactly. There's some evidence that certain immunomodulatory drugs,
Drugs that, like, modify the immune response.
right, might be helpful in treating protothecosis.
That's really exciting. So lots of potential on the horizon for better treatment options.
Yeah, there's hope for the future.
We also talked about how boxers seem to be more prone to getting protothecosis. Any research into why that is?
Researchers are trying to figure that out, yeah. One theory is that some boxers might be missing certain parts of their immune system that protect against prototheca.
Like a hidden vulnerability.
Right. If they can find the genes that are responsible, we could develop tests to screen dogs for this weakness.
And then breeders could use that information to make better decisions and hopefully reduce the risk in future generations.
Exactly. It's all about using science to improve the lives of these dogs.
It really is.
Yeah.
So this case, even though it's sad, has helped to push research forward and brought protothecosis into the spotlight.
It's a reminder that we still have a lot to learn about these unusual diseases.
For sure.
But with continued research and sharing what we know, we can get better at protecting our furry friends.
Well said. This has been a fascinating journey into the world of protothecosis, a disease that really shows how connected everything is: the environment, animal health, and scientific discovery.
From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.